The Murder of the Silent Passenger, a Sherlock Holmes mystery. Chapter 1. The 10:45 from Edinburgh. It was, Watson would later record, one of the bitterest Novembers London had endured in some years, a month of low skies and lower spirits, when the affair of the silent passenger came to Baker Street. The fog that year had a peculiar tenacity. It did not simply hang over the city but seemed to seep into the very timber of the houses, so that even indoors a man might feel the chill settle into his bones. It was against this backdrop, on a Tuesday evening in the third week of the month, that the 10:45 night mail from Edinburgh drew into King's Cross, carrying, in the third compartment of its leading first-class carriage, a passenger who would trouble the wits of Scotland Yard for the better part of a fortnight. I have set down, in the course of my long association with Mr. Sherlock Holmes, a great many singular cases, some involving crimes of violence so sudden and so brutal that their solution turned upon a single instant's observation, others so tangled in deception that months of patient labour were required before the truth could be fully drawn into the light. But I confess that of all the affairs in which I had the privilege of assisting, however modestly, few impressed themselves upon my memory so forcibly as that of the man who travelled the length of Great Britain without once opening his lips, and who died, in the end, as silently as he had lived among strangers, a silence broken only by the small, precise sound of a blade finding its mark, unheard by four fellow travellers, separated from the deed by no more than the thickness of a carriage partition. The man had boarded at Edinburgh under the name of Mr. Josiah Blackwood, a name that would prove, like so much else about him, to be only partially true. He was remembered by the guard, a steady, unimaginative fellow named Thomas Pike, chiefly for his silence. Mr. Blackwood did not speak. When the ticket was examined, he produced it without a word, indicating with a small, precise gesture of two fingers to his throat that he was unable to converse, and thereafter communicated, when communication was unavoidable, by means of a slim, ivory-handled notebook and a silver pencil, which he kept always in his waistcoat pocket. He was, by all accounts, a man in late middle age, dressed with the sober correctness of a solicitor or a bank official, his hair grey at the temples, his hands remarkably well kept for a man who claimed, in the single note he had shown to Pike, to have lost his voice in an accident in the Crimea some 30 years before. The train made its scheduled stop at York, and again at Grantham, and at each of these halts Pike had occasion to pass along the corridor, and had seen, through the glass of the compartment door, Mr. Blackwood sitting upright, apparently reading, a rug across his knees against the cold. It was not until the train was drawing near to its final approach, somewhere in the region of Hitchin, that Pike, making his last round before the terminus, found the compartment door secured from within, and, receiving no answer to his knock, felt the first prickling of unease that any conscientious servant of the railway feels when a passenger fails to respond. He did not at first think of forcing the door. It was only when the train began its final deceleration into King's Cross, and still no sound came from within, that Pike summoned the station-master's assistants, and between them, with a master key procured from the guard's van, they opened the compartment to find Mr. Josiah Blackwood dead in his seat, his silver pencil still loosely held in fingers already growing cold, a single wound beneath the fifth rib that had, by the evidence of the small quantity of blood upon his waistcoat, killed him with terrible swiftness and terrible quiet. The door had been locked from within. The window, a narrow thing designed more for ventilation than escape, was fastened by its brass catch precisely as the manufacturer had intended, immovable without considerable force, and certainly too small to have admitted a grown man. There was no weapon in the compartment, no sign of struggle, no disturbance to the dead man's belongings save that his dispatch case, a stout leather affair with brass corners, which Pike distinctly recalled seeing beside him at York, was nowhere to be found. It was Inspector Lestrade, summoned from the yard within the hour, who first used the word that would attach itself to the case in every newspaper account for a week thereafter. Impossible. He used it, in fact, 3 times within Watson's hearing the following morning, standing before the fire in the sitting room at Baker Street, with the particular aggrieved expression of a man who has been made to feel a fool by circumstances entirely beyond his control. I tell you, Mr. Holmes, I have seen locked rooms before, and I have generally found some window left ajar, some trick of a bolt that could be worked from the corridor with a length of wire. But this is a railway carriage, sir, not a country house with a dozen doors and passages. There is one door, one window, and both were secure as a bank vault. And yet the man is dead, stabbed clean through, and his case gone as though it had never existed. Holmes, who had been examining a chemical stain upon his fingers, with an air of mild scholarly interest quite disproportionate to the gravity of Lestrade's account, looked up at last with the particular brightening of the eye that Watson had learned to recognize as the first stirring of genuine engagement. "You interest me, Lestrade," said he. "Pray sit down and begin again, from the beginning, and omit nothing, however trivial it may seem to you. It is precisely the trivial things, in my experience, that hang men or acquit them." Chapter 2. A Problem for Baker Street. Before Lestrade had properly settled himself into the basket chair by the fire, Holmes had performed one of those small feats of observation which never failed to astonish Watson, however many times he witnessed them, and which served, on this particular morning, as a kind of overture to the grim business that was to follow. "You have a new charwoman at the Yard, I perceive," Holmes remarked idly, tossing aside the chemical-stained handkerchief he had been examining. "And she does not approve of your pipe." Lestrade, who had been in the act of reaching for that very article, stopped with his hand halfway to his coat and stared. "Now, how the deuce could you know that, Mr. Holmes? I've said nothing of any charwoman." "You have not needed to. There is a faint smell of carbolic soap about your coat that was not there when last you called in September, and a small triangular scorch mark upon the left cuff of recent origin, consistent with a pipe knocked from a desk in haste rather than set down with care, the mark of someone who snatched it up and thrust it out of sight before it could be seen and confiscated. Your right forefinger, moreover, lacks its usual tobacco stain, which tells me you have not smoked this morning, though the hour is well advanced for a man of your habits. I conclude a new and disapproving presence has entered your office, and that you are, for the moment, keeping the peace. It's my sister-in-law's girl, taken on temporary while old Mrs. Hobbs is laid up," Lestrade admitted, with the sheepish look of a man caught out in a domestic small matter. "And she's a positive tyrant about the ash on the carpet. But I didn't come here to talk about my pipe, Mr. Holmes." "No," said Holmes, all levity gone from his face in an instant. "You came about the man on the Edinburgh train. Watson, be so good as to fetch my notebook from the second drawer. Now, Lestrade, the beginning, if you please, and every particular." Lestrade told the tale much as it has been set down above. The silent Mr. Blackwood, his boarding at Edinburgh, the guard Pike's observations at each stopping-place, the discovery of the locked compartment, the wound, the missing dispatch case. Holmes listened without interruption, his long fingers steepled before his lips, his eyes half closed in the attitude of concentration that Watson had come to associate with the fullest exercise of that singular mind. "You say the man was known as Blackwood," Holmes said when the inspector had finished. "Was that his true name?" "We cannot yet say. His railway ticket was purchased under that name at Waverley Station the previous afternoon. He carried no other papers upon his person, no cards, no letters, nothing to identify him beyond a monogrammed handkerchief bearing the initials E.C. We have wired to Edinburgh, but as yet nothing has come back. A man who does not speak, and who now in death cannot even be named," Holmes murmured. "There is something almost poetic in that, Lestrade, though I doubt the poor devil would have appreciated the observation. What of the other occupants of the carriage?" 4 other first-class compartments were occupied that night, a Mrs. Ophelia Grant, a widow travelling alone, a Mr. Julius Ashworth, a solicitor of Gray's Inn, a Colonel Reginald Vane, lately of the Indian Army, and a young woman, a Miss Eleanor Faulkner, travelling, she says, to take up a position as governess in London. None of them claims to have heard anything unusual, though Mrs. Grant did mention raised voices at some point in the evening, which she took at the time for an argument between two gentlemen further down the corridor. An argument, said Holmes, and something in his tone made Watson glance up sharply. That is our first thread, Lestrade, however slender. I think, Watson, that we had better see this train for ourselves before the railway company, in its zeal for punctuality, restores the carriage to service and scours away whatever remains for us to read. Lestrade, can you arrange that the compartment be held undisturbed until we arrive? I've already given the order, Mr. Holmes. The carriage is shunted onto a siding at King's Cross, under guard. Excellent. Then let us lose no time. Watson, your hat and coat, if you please, and bring your revolver. I do not say we shall need it, but a man capable of murder in so confined and public a space as a moving railway carriage, without so much as a cry being raised, is not a man to be approached carelessly. Chapter 3. The Locked Compartment. The fog had thickened by the time their cab drew up alongside the siding at King's Cross, so that the carriage itself seemed to materialize out of the grey air only as they approached it directly. A long dark shape upon the rails, its brass fittings dulled by the damp. A constable stood shivering by the steps and touched his helmet to Lestrade before standing aside to let the party pass. Holmes went first, and Watson, following him into the corridor of the carriage, was struck at once by the narrowness of the space, a passage scarcely wide enough for two men to pass, running the length of the carriage past a series of compartment doors, each fitted with a small window of frosted glass. The third compartment stood open. Its door swung back, and within, though the body itself had been removed to the mortuary some hours before, the signs of what had occurred remained plainly visible. A dark stain upon the upholstered seat, a rug fallen half to the floor, and, upon the small fixed table beneath the window, an inkstand, undisturbed, and a single sheet of notepaper upon which nothing had been written. Holmes stood for a long moment in the doorway without entering, his eyes travelling over every surface with the slow, methodical thoroughness that Watson had seen him bring to 100 such scenes before. Then, producing his lens from his waistcoat pocket, he stepped inside and began his examination in earnest, moving with a kind of contained energy, now crouching to study the floor, now standing upon the seat itself to peer at the luggage rack above. "The door," he said at length, without turning. "Lestrade, describe to me precisely how it was found." "Locked, Mr. Holmes, by the interior catch, that brass fitting you see there, just above the handle. It can only be turned from inside the compartment. There is no keyhole or mechanism accessible from the corridor. Pike had to fetch the guard's emergency key, which operates a separate mechanism entirely, cutting through the bolt housing itself, for use in cases of accident." Holmes examined the catch with his lens for the better part of 2 minutes, turning it gently upon its pivot, testing the give of the mechanism, before straightening with a small, private smile that Watson recognized as the outward sign of an inward satisfaction. "And the window?" "Fastened, as I told you, by its own catch, and in any case too narrow for a man to pass through." "Too narrow for a man, certainly," Holmes agreed, moving now to the window and running his fingers along its frame. "But I did not ask about a man." He paused and drew from the narrow gap between the window frame and its rubber seal a single fibre, pale and fine, which he held up to the light with an expression of quiet triumph, before consigning it carefully to an envelope produced from his pocket. "You will observe, Lestrade, that this fibre has nothing whatever to do with any garment worn by the dead man. His coat, as I understand from your own inventory, was of fine broadcloth, and this is coarse hempen stuff, the sort of material one finds in a ship's rigging or a soldier's kit bag rather than in a gentleman's travelling wardrobe. It has no business here at all, and a thing that has no business being present is, in my experience, very often the single most important thing in the room. He turned next to the seat itself, drawing back the loosened rug to examine the cushion beneath, with an attention that seemed, to Watson's eye, almost excessive for so unpromising a surface. The dead man sat here, facing the direction of travel at the outset of the journey, according to Pike, and later shifted to face backward. A small thing, and yet men do not generally reverse their seats upon a long journey without some reason, however trivial it may have seemed to him at the time. Was he avoiding a draught, avoiding the low winter sun upon the earlier stages of the run, or was he, perhaps, positioning himself to watch the corridor through the frosted glass of the door, rather than the darkened countryside beyond the window? He straightened, brushing a fleck of dust from his sleeve. I incline toward the last explanation, Watson, though I offer it for the present only as a working hypothesis, to be tested against whatever further facts we gather. Watson, your observations, if you please. What do you make of the floor beneath the door? Watson, thus appealed to, knelt as best he could in the confined space and studied the worn carpet of the compartment floor, running close under the door itself. There is a scuff mark here, Holmes, quite fresh by the look of it, a scrape in the pile of the carpet, running toward the door rather than away from it. Good, Watson, very good. And what else? I confess I see nothing further of significance. No matter. You have seen the essential thing, though you have not yet understood its meaning, which is very often the way of it in this profession. Lestrade, I should like, if it can be arranged, to examine the compartments to either side, Mrs. Grant's and that of the gentleman who occupied the corridor position nearest the connecting door. And I should like, above all, to speak with the guard Pike, who I think has more to tell us than he yet realizes he knows. Chapter 4. Threads of Silence. Thomas Pike proved to be a solid, respectable man of perhaps 45, with the weathered, patient face of one who had spent a working lifetime attending to the small comforts and larger anxieties of strangers. He met them in the station-master's office at Lestrade's summons, twisting his guard's cap between broad hands with evident nervousness, as though he suspected himself somehow at fault for the tragedy that had occurred under his charge. "I've told the inspector everything I know, sir," he said, when Holmes had introduced himself, "and I don't rightly see what more there is to tell." "I am sure you have told him everything you believe to be relevant," Holmes said, in the gentler tone he reserved for witnesses of this sort, honest men frightened by their unwitting proximity to violent death. "But I have found, Mr. Pike, that a man in your position often knows a great deal more than he supposes, simply through the habit of long observation. Tell me first, when Mr. Blackwood boarded at Edinburgh, was he alone?" "Quite alone, sir. He come onto the platform not 5 minutes before the whistle, walking quick for a man of his years, and got straight into his compartment without a word to anyone, which I noted at the time, him being unable to speak and all. And his dispatch case, can you describe it more particularly?" "Stout brown leather, sir, with brass corners gone a bit green with age, and a lock of the ordinary kind. He kept it beside him on the seat the whole journey, far as I could tell, and had his hand resting on it more often than not, like a man who values what's inside more than is common." "A most significant habit," Holmes murmured. "Now, Pike, I want you to think very carefully. At each of your rounds, York, Grantham, and the final approach to King's Cross, in what position did you find Mr. Blackwood sitting?" Pike frowned in the effort of recollection. "At York, sir, he was sat facing the engine, same as he'd started. At Grantham I recall he'd shifted to the other seat, facing back the way we'd come. I remember thinking it queer, for most gentlemen prefer to ride facing forward, but I thought no more of it at the time." "Excellent, excellent. And did you, at either of these stops, observe any of the other passengers moving about the corridor?" "Now that you mention it, sir, yes. At York I passed the Colonel Vane, that is, coming back along the corridor from the direction of the guard's van. Said he'd been to inquire about a telegram he was expecting to be handed up at the next stop. And at Grantham, I believe, I saw the young lady, Miss Faulkner, standing at the connecting door between the carriages, though she moved back into her own compartment quick enough when she saw me coming. Holmes's eyes had taken on the particular glitter that Watson associated with the scent of a genuine trail. One thing more, Pike, and then I think we have troubled you enough. You mentioned raised voices to the inspector, reported to you by Mrs. Grant. Did you yourself hear anything of the sort? I did, sir, though I couldn't say clear which compartment it come from, the walls being thin enough that voices carry along the corridor rather than through the partitions. If you take my meaning, it was somewhere between York and Grantham, and it sounded to me like two men, one of them raised in anger, though I couldn't make out the words. I thought it none of my business, sir, gentlemen having their differences same as anyone, and I didn't investigate. You could not have known, Holmes said, and I do not think any blame attaches to you, Pike. You have been most helpful. He rose, and Watson, following his lead, did likewise. Lestrade, I think we have done what we can here for the present. I should like now to call upon the surviving passengers, beginning, I think, with the solicitor, Mr. Ashworth, for it is my understanding that a solicitor of Gray's Inn keeps regular hours, and we may catch him at his chambers before the day is entirely spent. Chapter 5. The Man Who Never Spoke. It was not, in the end, Mr. Ashworth whom they saw first, for upon returning to Baker Street to leave word of their movements, they found awaiting them a telegram from Edinburgh that altered the shape of the whole inquiry. It came from the Edinburgh police, in response to Lestrade's wire of the previous night, and it read, in the clipped official language of such communications, "No record of Josiah Blackwood at any address known to us. Stop however description matches closely that of Edmund Carswell. Formerly of this city, Stop Carswell left Scotland under a cloud. Some 15 years past. Stop further particulars to follow." Carswell, Holmes repeated, turning the telegram over in his hands as though the reverse side might yield further information by mere proximity. "The initials upon the handkerchief, Watson. If you recall, E.C. It fits well enough. A man who invents a name for his travels is a man with reason to hide his true one, and a man who hides his true name so thoroughly, even from a simple guard on a night train, is a man who has made a study of secrecy. You think his muteness was itself a deception? I think, Watson, that we must consider every element of this man's presentation with the gravest suspicion, precisely because he presented himself so completely as a man beyond suspicion. Consider, what manner of man arouses less curiosity, invites less conversation, than one who cannot speak? He becomes, in effect, invisible, present in body, but excluded by the ordinary courtesies of travel from any exchange that might reveal his purposes. A talking man is questioned, a silent man is merely pitied and left alone. Further particulars did indeed follow, delivered by a second telegram within the hour, and painted a portrait of Edmund Carswell considerably less sympathetic than that of the pitiable mute traveller who had died in compartment 3. Carswell, it transpired, had been a man of business in Edinburgh with a curious sideline. Curious, that is, until one understood its true nature, as a collector and broker of private information. He had made his fortune, such as it was, not through honest trade but through a patient, methodical harvesting of other men's secrets. Debts unpaid, liaisons unwise, sums borrowed and never returned, letters that ought never to have been written. He had left Edinburgh 15 years before, under circumstances the Edinburgh police described only as irregular, following the sudden and unexplained ruin of a prominent local banker who had, it was whispered, been paying Carswell a substantial sum each quarter to ensure certain facts about his private affairs remained private. "A blackmailer," said Lestrade, when Holmes had laid the substance of the telegrams before him that evening at Baker Street, "and a peculiarly patient and cunning one, If he could keep such a trade running for 15 years without so much as a whisper reaching the authorities. Patient, cunning, and possessed of a genius for disguise that went far beyond the mere invention of a false name, Holmes said. I begin to suspect, Lestrade, that our Mr. Carswell had discovered, some years ago, that the pretense of muteness was the single most effective instrument in his entire professional apparatus. Think of it. A man who does not speak is, by the same token, a man who is presumed not to hear with particular attention, not to remember with particular clarity, not to understand the low, murmured confidences exchanged by others in his presence, who believe themselves unobserved. He would have travelled thus for years, I do not doubt, gathering by silent attention what no amount of direct questioning could ever have extracted, and recording it, no doubt, in that very notebook the guard described, or in others like it now vanished along with his dispatch case. Watson felt a chill quite unrelated to the November damp outside their windows. Then the dispatch case contained, I have very little doubt, the accumulated fruits of that harvest. Letters, notes, perhaps photographs, sufficient to ruin any number of respectable reputations should their contents become known. And someone aboard that train, Watson, knew or guessed as much, and valued the destruction of those contents, or their possession, above the risk of murder committed in a moving carriage with 4 other passengers within call. That is not the act of a man driven to sudden fury. That is the act of a man who had calculated, with some care, that the risk was worth the taking. Holmes rose and crossed to the window, drawing back the curtain to look out upon the fog-shrouded street below, his hands clasped behind his back, in the attitude Watson had come to recognize as signifying the deepest currents of thought. We are not looking, Lestrade, for a man who lost his temper. We are looking for a man, or conceivably a woman, who had been made to fear discovery of something they could not afford to have discovered, and who found, in the peculiar isolation of a night train, an opportunity that would not come again. That narrows the field very little, Mr. Holmes, if Carswell's trade was as extensive as these telegrams suggest. The man may have preyed upon a dozen victims or 50. It narrows the field considerably more than you suppose, Lestrade, for we are not seeking any of Carswell's 50 victims, but only that one among them, if indeed it was a victim rather than some other party entirely, who chanced to occupy the same railway carriage on that particular night, and who possessed, moreover, both the nerve and the opportunity to act. That is no longer a search among 50 men scattered across the length of Great Britain, but a search among 4 persons, each already known to us by name, each already interviewed by your own officers, and each, I do not doubt, already harbouring some private account of that evening that does not tell the whole truth. Our task, gentlemen, is not to invent a murderer out of the air, but to determine which of 4 very ordinary-seeming travellers concealed, beneath an ordinary exterior, a secret Carswell had contrived to make his own. Watson, listening to this exchange with the particular fascination he never wholly lost for the workings of his friend's mind, could not help but ask the question that had been forming in his own thoughts throughout the recitation of Carswell's history. Do you suppose, Holmes, that any of the 4 we have already met might themselves have been among his victims, all unknown to us as yet? I suppose it very probable, Watson, that at least one of them was, for a man does not travel in the compartment adjoining his blackmailers by pure and innocent chance, not when the coincidence is examined with sufficient scepticism. It is a great deal more likely, to my mind, that Carswell had arranged his own travel to coincide with that of a client whose payment was overdue, or whose nerve he wished to test at close quarters, than that 4 strangers with no prior connection to the man should happen to share a carriage with him by the blind operation of chance alone. That, indeed, is very much what I intend to determine when we call upon them tomorrow. Chapter 6. The Moneylender's Ledger. Mr. Julius Ashworth received them in his chambers at Gray's Inn the following morning. A tall, stooping man of perhaps 50 years, whose fine grey suit could not entirely disguise a certain threadbare quality about the cuffs, nor the anxious, hunted look that had settled into his features. He had, Watson thought, the appearance of a man who had not slept. "I have already told the inspector everything I know," Ashworth said, echoing Pike's words of the previous day almost precisely, though with considerably less composure. "I did not know the man. I had never seen him before in my life, until he boarded that train." "And yet," Holmes said mildly, taking the chair Ashworth had not offered him, "you were heard arguing with someone in that carriage, Mr. Ashworth, at some point between York and Grantham. Was that someone not Mr. Carswell?" The solicitor's face, already pale, went paler still. "How did you—" He stopped himself and passed a hand across his brow. "Very well. Yes, I did exchange words with him, though not in the manner you suppose. He did not speak to me, could not, or so I believed at the time, but he passed me a note in that infernal little book of his, and the note—" He broke off again, and Watson saw his hands, resting on the desk before him, had begun to tremble. "The note concerned a debt," Holmes said, not as a question. Ashworth looked up sharply. "You know a great deal for a man who was not present, Mr. Holmes. I know that Mr. Carswell, under his true name of Edmund Carswell, made a considerable fortune from the private misfortunes of others. I know that a solicitor's income, however respectable in appearance, does not always keep pace with a solicitor's expenditure, particularly when that expenditure runs, shall we say, to certain establishments in the neighbourhood of Leicester Square, where the play runs high and the company runs low. I know, further, that a man deep in debt to a professional collector of secrets, finding himself unexpectedly and inescapably confined in a railway carriage with his creditor for some 5 hours, might feel the walls closing in upon him in a manner not experienced since his schooldays. Ashworth's composure, such as it had been, collapsed entirely under this recital. He buried his face in his hands for a long moment, and when he spoke again his voice had lost all its earlier defensiveness, reduced to a kind of exhausted candour. "I owed him £800, Mr. Holmes. £800, borrowed over 3 years to cover losses I was too great a fool and too great a coward to confess to my partners. He had threatened, only that week, to write to the senior partner of this firm unless the debt were settled within the month, a threat he knew perfectly well I had no means of meeting. When I boarded that train and found him in the very next compartment, I confess my first feeling was one of pure horror, as though fate itself had contrived to mock me. "And so you went to him," Holmes said. "I went to him, yes, somewhere after York, and I begged him, I am not ashamed to admit it now, though I was ashamed enough at the time. I begged him for an extension, for mercy, for anything short of the ruin he proposed to visit upon me. He would not speak, of course, but he wrote his answer, and it was a single word, no. I lost my temper, Mr. Holmes. I will not pretend otherwise. I said things to that man I am not proud of, and I said them loudly enough, it seems, to be overheard. But I did not kill him. I left his compartment in a fury, yes, but I left it with him very much alive, sitting there with that maddening, silent, superior look upon his face, and I did not return." "Can anyone confirm that you did not return?" Ashworth's shoulders sagged. "No one saw me after I returned to my own compartment. I sat alone, Mr. Holmes, nursing my anger and my despair in equal measure, until the train reached King's Cross, and I learned, along with everyone else, that Carswell was dead. And I will confess to you, God forgive me, that my very first thought, before horror, before pity, was relief. Blessed, shameful relief that my debt had died with my creditor." Holmes regarded the wretched man for a long moment in silence. "That is either the confession of an innocent man too honest to disguise an unworthy emotion," he said at last, "or it is a very clever performance indeed by a guilty one. I confess, Mr. Ashworth, I have not yet decided which." He rose and walked slowly about the small chamber, his eyes travelling over the shelves of leather-bound volumes, the neat stacks of brief and precedent, the framed certificate of admission to the rolls that hung, a little crookedly, above the mantel. "You have practised here how long?" 11 years, Mr. Holmes, man and boy. Articled here at 22, and admitted a partner these 3 years past, though the partnership has brought me considerably more anxiety than profit, given my private difficulties. "And your partners are unaware of the extent of those difficulties?" "Entirely unaware, and I have prayed nightly that they should remain so, for exposure would mean not merely financial ruin, but the loss of everything I have built here. My name struck from the rolls, in all likelihood. For a solicitor who gambles his client's confidence away at the card table is not one the Law Society looks upon with mercy." Ashworth's voice had sunk to little more than a whisper. "That is the whole of why Carswell's death, God forgive me, brought me a moment's relief before the horror of it overtook me. You must understand, Mr. Holmes, that I had lived for 3 years under a sentence that might be executed at any hour of his choosing, and a condemned man does not mourn the loss of his executioner merely because good manners require it. I should be obliged if you would remain within reach of the authorities until this matter is resolved," Holmes said at last, "and I should further advise you, as a friend rather than an investigator, to make a full and voluntary confession of your difficulties to your partners at the earliest opportunity, whatever the outcome of this inquiry. A secret once nearly fatal to a man's liberty is not one he can safely go on carrying alone." Chapter 7. A Widow's Unease. Mrs. Ophelia Grant occupied rooms in a quiet square in Bloomsbury, a small establishment kept with the particular fastidiousness of a woman living carefully upon a limited income. She was younger than Watson had expected from the word widow, perhaps 35, with an intelligent, watchful face, and hands that moved restlessly among the folds of her dark shawl throughout the interview, betraying an agitation her composed voice largely concealed. "I have told the police what I heard," she said, when they were seated in her small parlour, "though I confess I have wondered since whether I ought to have said more, or perhaps less." "Tell us again, in your own words, Mrs. Grant, and take your time," Holmes said, with the particular gentleness he reserved for witnesses of evident good faith. "I find that a tale told twice often yields details missed in the first telling. I occupied the compartment adjoining Mr. Blackwood's. I ought to say Mr. Carswell's, I suppose, though I knew him only by the false name. I had retired early, being tired from my journey down from Perth, and I believe I dozed for some while. I was woken by voices, 2 men, one of them raised in what I took for anger, though the words themselves were indistinct, muffled by the partition between our compartments. This would have been, I think, some time after the train left York." "That accords with what we have already learned," Holmes said. "Pray continue." The voices ceased after some minutes, and I heard what I took to be a door closing rather firmly, a man leaving in temper, I supposed at the time, and thought no more of it, such things being no great rarity when strangers are confined together for long hours. I slept again, or tried to, but woke a second time, and this, Mr. Holmes, is the part I have found hardest to describe to my own satisfaction, let alone to the inspector. Take whatever time you require. Mrs. Grant's hands stilled upon her shawl, and she looked at Holmes directly for the first time since they had entered. I woke because I heard, very faintly, a sound from the adjoining compartment. Not voices this time, but a kind of scraping, dragging sound, low down, as though something were being drawn along the floor or along the base of the partition wall. It lasted only a few seconds, and then there was silence. I confess I thought little of it at the time. One hears all manner of strange sounds aboard a moving train, the creak of luggage shifting, the scrape of a boot against woodwork. But since learning of what occurred, I have wondered whether I did not, in fact, hear something of real significance, and have been too frightened of appearing foolish to say so plainly. Holmes had gone very still, in the particular manner Watson recognized as denoting the keenest possible interest concealed beneath an appearance of calm. "You are quite certain of the direction of this sound, that it came from low down, near the floor?" "Quite certain, Mr. Holmes. It was that which struck me as strange even at the time, for it was not the sound of a man moving about, which one would expect to hear at the level of footsteps, or the shifting of a body in a seat, but something lower still, almost, though I hesitate to put it so fancifully, as though something were being drawn along beneath the very door itself." Watson saw Holmes's eyes flash with sudden light, though his voice remained perfectly level. "You have been of the very greatest assistance, Mrs. Grant, and you were not foolish to hesitate, for I promise you that what you have just described may prove to be the single most important observation made by anyone in this entire inquiry. One question more, if I may. At what hour would you estimate this second sound occurred?" "I cannot say with certainty, Mr. Holmes, not having consulted my watch, but I believe it was not very long before the guard's final round. Perhaps 20 minutes, or half an hour." "That is to say, very shortly before the discovery of the body," Holmes murmured, half to himself. "Thank you, Mrs. Grant. I would ask that you say nothing of this conversation to anyone else for the present, not from any wish to keep you in the dark, but because the value of what you know depends, for the moment, upon its remaining known only to us." Chapter 8. The Colonel's Courtesy. Colonel Reginald Vane proved, upon acquaintance, to be a man of considerable and immediately winning charm. Tall, weathered by long service in India, with a soldierly bearing and a ready smile that put Watson, at least, at his ease within moments of their meeting at the Colonel's Club in Pall Mall. He received them in the smoking-room with every appearance of cheerful cooperation, ordering coffee for the party before Holmes had so much as stated the purpose of their visit. "A wretched business, Mr. Holmes, wretched," he said, settling into his chair with the easy confidence of a man entirely at home in his surroundings. "I have thought of little else since it occurred. Ask me anything you wish. I have nothing to hide, and I am only too glad to assist Scotland Yard in whatever small way I can." "You are very obliging, Colonel," Holmes said. "Perhaps you might begin by telling us your impressions of your fellow passengers that night." "Gladly. There was poor Ashworth, of course, whom I understand has fallen under some suspicion, and I must say, Mr. Holmes, between ourselves, I think it very hard on the fellow. I passed him in the corridor not an hour before the alarm was raised, and he seemed to me a man merely troubled by private cares, nothing more sinister than that. I have known Ashworth slightly for some years, through club acquaintance, and I have never known him to be anything but scrupulously honest, whatever his private difficulties may have been. It would grieve me considerably to see an innocent man made to suffer for another's crime." Holmes's expression did not change, but Watson, who knew him well, caught the faint sharpening of attention that this unsolicited character reference provoked. "That is generous of you, Colonel, particularly as I understand you and Mr. Ashworth were not previously well acquainted. Slightly acquainted, as I say, enough to form an impression, not enough to call friendship. But I have always prided myself on judging a man's character quickly and, I flatter myself, accurately. It is a soldier's habit, Mr. Holmes. One learns in 20 years of service to read a man's mettle at a glance, for one's life may depend upon it." "A most valuable talent," Holmes agreed. "And what was your impression of Mr. Blackwood, or Carswell, as we now know him to have been?" "I confess I paid the fellow little attention. A silent, self-contained sort of man, I thought, and I am ashamed to say I did not trouble myself to wonder what lay behind that silence. Had I known what manner of man he truly was, Mr. Holmes, I should have taken very good care to avoid his compartment altogether." "You did not then have occasion to speak with him, or rather, to receive any written communication from him, in the manner he customarily employed?" For the first time, something flickered behind the Colonel's easy smile, so brief and so quickly mastered that Watson, watching less closely than Holmes, very nearly missed it. "No, Mr. Holmes, none whatever. I exchanged not a single word, written or otherwise, with the man. I passed him in the corridor once or twice, as one does aboard a train, and inclined my head in the ordinary courtesy one extends to a fellow traveller, and that was the whole of our acquaintance. I see. And your movements that evening. The guard recalls encountering you near the guard's van at York, in connection, I believe, with an expected telegram. Quite right. I was expecting word from my solicitor regarding a small property matter, and had arranged for it to be handed up at York should it arrive in time. It had not, as it happened, and I returned to my compartment disappointed but otherwise unremarkable. Holmes rose at length, thanking the Colonel for his time with every appearance of satisfaction, and it was not until they were once more in the street, walking toward Piccadilly through the thinning afternoon fog, that Watson ventured to remark upon what had struck him as a curiously agreeable interview. He seemed most anxious to help Holmes, and most anxious too to speak well of Ashworth. Does that not argue in the Colonel's favour, and, incidentally, in Ashworth's? It argues nothing of the sort, Watson, or rather, it argues precisely the opposite of what it appears to argue, and that is what troubles me. Holmes's face, in the grey light, had taken on the keen, hawk-like intensity that Watson associated with his deepest suspicions. Consider the matter dispassionately. A man who has nothing to hide answers questions. He does not volunteer character references for a fellow suspect, unprompted and unnecessary, in a case where his own conduct has not yet been called into serious question. The Colonel's generosity toward Ashworth struck me as considerably too generous, too smoothly delivered, too precisely calculated to divert suspicion from a man whose difficulties with Carswell are already known to the police, and thereby, by natural extension, away from anyone else who might have had dealings with the dead man that are not yet known at all. You suspect him, then? I suspect everyone, Watson, until the facts compel me to suspect no longer. But I will say this. A man who has never known Ashworth to be anything but scrupulously honest, on the strength of slight club acquaintance, is either a remarkably poor judge of character, for a man who prides himself on judging character at a glance, or he is lying to us, smoothly and with great skill, for reasons of his own. Chapter 9. The Hidden Inconsistency. That evening, alone in the sitting-room at Baker Street, while Watson attended to correspondence of his own, Holmes spread before him upon the table the small collection of evidence gathered thus far. The pale fibre drawn from the window-seal, wrapped now in a twist of paper, his notes of the compartment's dimensions and fittings, sketched in his own precise hand, and a small stub of candle wax, scraped that afternoon, unbeknownst to Watson, who had been occupied elsewhere at the time, from the underside of the compartment door, where it had lodged, nearly invisible, in the narrow gap between door and threshold. He worked in silence for the better part of 2 hours, testing the wax under his lens, comparing it against samples from his own considerable reference collection, measuring with calipers the precise width of the gap beneath the compartment door, as recorded in his notes. When at last he set down his instruments, there was upon his face an expression Watson, returning to the room near midnight, recognized at once and with some misgiving, the look of a man who has arrived at a conclusion he does not yet wish to share. "You have found something," Watson said, settling into his chair by the dying fire. "I have found the answer to the locked room, Watson, or very nearly the whole of it," Holmes said, though he made no move to elaborate further, turning instead to fill his pipe with the deliberate, unhurried motions of a man postponing a conversation he is not yet ready to have. "But I will not lay it before you tonight, nor before Lestrade tomorrow, for the plain reason that a partial truth, spoken too soon, is more dangerous in a case of this kind than silence itself. That is unlike you, Holmes. You have generally shared your reasoning with me as it develops, even when incomplete. I share it when the sharing does no harm, Watson, and I withhold it when I judge that harm might follow from a premature disclosure. Consider, if I tell Lestrade tonight that I know, or believe I know, the mechanism by which our murderer secured that door from the outside. He will act upon it at once, as is his nature and indeed his duty. He will confront our suspects, perhaps arrest one of them upon evidence that, while suggestive, is not yet conclusive, and in doing so he will alert the true culprit, whoever that may be, to precisely how much we have discovered. A guilty man forewarned is a guilty man who destroys what remains of the evidence against him and constructs, at his leisure, an unshakable account of his own innocence. No, Watson, for the present, this knowledge remains between these four walls, and I would ask that you say nothing of it, even to Lestrade, until I judge the moment ripe. Watson, though troubled by this unusual reticence, knew better than to press his friend upon a matter he had so plainly decided to keep close. Very well, Holmes, but you will tell me this much at least. Does what you have found point more toward one suspect than another? Holmes was silent for a long moment, watching the last embers settle in the grate. It points, Watson, toward a particular kind of man, a methodical man, a patient man, a man accustomed to working with his hands in circumstances requiring both nerve and precision, and, I think, a man who has passed some portion of his life in circumstances where such a trick might plausibly have been learned or observed. Beyond that, I will say nothing more tonight, save that I believe our murderer is not yet finished, and that the dispatch case, wherever it now lies, remains the true prize of this whole grim affair, and the greatest danger to whoever presently holds it. Chapter 10. Scotland Yard's Certainty. The following morning brought Lestrade to Baker Street in a state of considerable self-satisfaction, his usual sallow features flushed with the particular pleasure of a man who believes himself upon the verge of a triumph. "We have him, Mr. Holmes," he announced, before he had fairly crossed the threshold. "Ashworth. We searched his chambers this morning under warrant and found, concealed in a locked drawer of his desk, a naval dagger of Eastern pattern, its blade recently cleaned, but not, I think, cleaned quite well enough to satisfy our surgeon, who has found traces in the join of the hilt consistent with the dead man's blood. We have arrested him, and I dare say the case is very nearly closed." Watson saw Holmes's brow contract sharply. "A dagger, you say? Where precisely was it found?" "In a drawer of his writing desk, beneath a quantity of legal papers, as though he had thrust it out of sight in haste, and had not yet found opportunity to dispose of it more thoroughly." "And has Ashworth offered any account of the weapon?" "He claims it was a gift from a client some years past, a curio he kept as an ornament, and had entirely forgotten, and that he cannot account for the bloodstains at all, save to suggest they might be some old mark predating his ownership of the thing." "A feeble defence, Mr. Holmes, and I think a jury will find it so." Holmes rose and paced the length of the room twice before speaking again, his hands clasped behind him, his brow furrowed in evident dissatisfaction. "It is too neat, Lestrade. It is very much too neat, and I confess it troubles me considerably more than it appears to trouble you." "Too neat, Mr. Holmes? I should have thought you of all men would appreciate evidence that fits its case so precisely." "I appreciate evidence that emerges through patient investigation, Lestrade, not evidence that presents itself, gift-wrapped, in the first drawer a search warrant happens to open. Consider the character of the man who has, by every account we have gathered, planned and executed a murder of quite extraordinary technical cunning, a murder committed in a locked compartment aboard a moving train, without raising a cry, and accomplished, moreover, by a mechanism sufficiently ingenious that even now I have not laid the whole of it before you. Does such a man, patient, methodical, capable of the coldest calculation, strike you as the sort who would then carry his murder weapon home and conceal it, imperfectly cleaned, in the most obvious drawer of his own writing desk, to be discovered by the first constable who thinks to look?" Lestrade's satisfaction wavered visibly. "Men do foolish things after a crime, Mr. Holmes, even clever men. Panic does strange work upon the nerves." Panic, perhaps, in a man who acted upon sudden impulse. But our murderer did not act upon impulse, Lestrade. Everything about that locked compartment speaks of forethought, of a plan conceived before ever the train left Edinburgh, or very shortly after. Such a man does not panic afterward in so careless a fashion. I put it to you, Lestrade, that the dagger was placed in Ashworth's desk by another hand entirely, placed there, indeed, precisely because Ashworth's quarrel with the dead man was already known to the police, making him the most convenient of scapegoats for anyone wishing to close this case swiftly and safely, at the cost of an innocent man's neck. That is a grave supposition, Mr. Holmes, and I cannot act upon supposition alone. The evidence, such as it stands, points to Ashworth, and I must follow where the evidence leads. Then follow it a little further before you commit yourself irrevocably, Holmes said. Give me 3 days, Lestrade, only 3, before you bring this matter before a magistrate. I ask it not to obstruct your investigation, but to complete it, for I believe most sincerely that the true murderer remains at liberty, and that he has been considerably assisted in his liberty by your very natural eagerness to see this matter concluded. Lestrade sat for a long while in silence, turning his glass between his fingers, torn visibly between the comfortable certainty of a case already, to his mind, as good as closed, and the uneasy memory of how many times in the past Holmes's misgivings had proved in the end better founded than his own official confidence. 3 days, Mr. Holmes, he said at last, with the air of a man conceding more than he wished, and not an hour more. I have my superiors to answer to, and they will not thank me for delay on a case the newspapers are already calling solved. But I will own that dagger has troubled me rather more than I let on this morning. It is a queer sort of carelessness for a man clever enough to arrange the rest of it, if arrange it he did. You begin to see my difficulty, then. I begin to see it, Mr. Holmes, though I do not yet see my way past it. Very well, 3 days, and Ashworth remains in custody meanwhile. For I cannot in conscience release a man against whom such evidence, however troubling to you, has been formally laid. But I will hold the magistrate's hearing back until Friday, and no longer. That is all I ask, Holmes said, and I believe, Lestrade, you will find the 3 days well spent before they are out. Chapter 11. A Second Silence. The 3 days Holmes had requested had not yet run their course when a fresh development arrived to lend weight to his misgivings. It came in the form of a hurried note from Mrs. Grant, delivered by messenger to Baker Street on the second evening, its handwriting considerably less composed than that lady's earlier correspondence had led Watson to expect. Dear Mr. Holmes, I beg you will come at once if you can spare the time. I have received, not an hour since, a communication I do not know how to interpret save as a threat, and I confess myself thoroughly frightened. It was left at my door by hand, by no one my landlady can describe with any particularity, and it consists of a single line. Those who hear too much sometimes hear their last. I do not know what to make of it, save that it can only refer to the unhappy events aboard the train, and I find I cannot rest easy until I have spoken with you. Oh, Grant Holmes read the note twice, his face grave, before passing it to Watson. This confirms what I have suspected since our interview with Mrs. Grant, Watson, that her account of the sound she heard beneath the compartment door was of greater significance than even she herself realized, and that someone is now aware, or fears, that she has told us more than was safe for her to tell. Fetch your revolver, Watson, and let us go to her at once. I do not like the timing of this at all. But how could our murderer know what Mrs. Grant told us, Holmes? We have spoken of it to no one outside these rooms and Lestrade's own office. That is precisely what troubles me most, Watson. Either our murderer has some source of information within the yard itself, which I think unlikely, for Lestrade is a careful man whatever his other limitations, or he has reasoned his way to the same conclusion I myself reached, namely, that a woman occupying the adjoining compartment could scarcely have failed to hear something of what passed that night, and that her continued silence on the point cannot be counted upon indefinitely. A guilty man in fear of discovery does not require certain knowledge of what a witness has said. The mere possibility that she may have heard and understood enough to be dangerous is sufficient to prompt him towards silencing her, whether by threat or by more permanent means. We must not delay. They found Mrs. Grant considerably shaken but physically unharmed, her small parlour lit against the early dark by every lamp the house possessed, as though light itself might hold at bay whatever threat had reached her door. Holmes examined the note with his lens, though he confessed, after some minutes' study, that it offered little in the way of direct evidence: cheap paper, purchasable at any stationer's in London, and lettering deliberately disguised through the use of a ruler to guide each stroke, defeating any attempt to match it against a natural hand. "You are quite certain no one saw who delivered this?" "My landlady says only that she heard a knock, and upon opening the door found no one there, only the envelope upon the step. It might have been left by anyone, Mr. Holmes, and that is what frightens me most, that I cannot even say from which direction the danger comes." "I will arrange for a constable to watch this house discreetly for the present," Holmes said, "though I do not think in truth that you are in immediate danger, Mrs. Grant. Your correspondent's purpose, I believe, is to frighten you into silence rather than to harm you outright, for a second death so soon upon the first would draw precisely the scrutiny he can least afford. But I would ask you to consider carefully, once more, the sound you described to us, the low, scraping sound beneath the partition wall. Can you recall anything further, its duration, its rhythm, anything at all that struck you as unusual?" Mrs. Grant closed her eyes in the effort of recollection. "Now that I think on it with more care, Mr. Holmes, it was not a single continuous sound, but a series of small movements, as though something were being drawn, released, and drawn again, 2 or perhaps 3 times in succession, before falling still." Holmes's eyes met Watson's across the room, and Watson saw in them a flash of something very like triumph, swiftly suppressed, drawn, released, and drawn again. Holmes repeated softly, "Yes, that is entirely consistent with what I had already begun to suspect. Mrs. Grant, you have done more for the cause of justice in this affair than you can presently know, and I promise you that whatever threat has been made against you will be answered in full, very shortly, and by means that will astonish you." Chapter 12. The Governess's Secret. Of the 4 surviving passengers, only Miss Eleanor Faulkner remained to be interviewed, and it was Holmes's evident intention, as their cab carried them the following morning toward the modest house in Camden Town, where she had lately taken up her position, to approach this final witness with rather more delicacy than he had employed with the others. "She is very young, Watson, and travelling alone to a position she has only just secured. A governess's post is not one without considerable anxiety for a woman in her circumstances, and I would not add unnecessarily to whatever burdens she already carries. But I do not think we can afford to leave any thread unexamined, and there is something in the guard's account of her movements, that curious business at the connecting door at Grantham, that I wish very much to understand." Miss Faulkner proved to be a slight, pale young woman of perhaps 22, with quick, intelligent eyes, and a manner that struck Watson as guarded rather than merely shy. The wariness, he thought, of one who has learned through hard experience to be careful of what she reveals. She received them in the small schoolroom of her employer's house, between lessons, with evident nervousness that Holmes's gentle opening questions did little at first to dispel. "I have already told the police everything I observed, Mr. Holmes, which I fear was very little. I kept to my own compartment for the greater part of the journey, and saw nothing of the unfortunate Mr. Blackwood beyond a glimpse of him at the outset, when the guard checked our tickets. And yet the guard recalls seeing you at the connecting door between the carriages, at Grantham, in a manner he found sufficiently notable to mention to us particularly." A flush of colour rose in Miss Faulkner's pale cheeks. I had gone to take the air, Mr. Holmes, the compartment being close, and the night being long. There is no more to it than that." "I do not think that is the whole truth, Miss Faulkner. Holmes said, not unkindly, though I do not for one moment suppose you guilty of any crime. I have found, in a long experience of witnesses, that those who withhold some part of the truth from fear or shame very often withhold the very fact that would most swiftly clear them of suspicion, rather than condemn them further. Will you not trust me with whatever it is you have not yet told us?" For a long moment Miss Faulkner said nothing, her hands twisting in her lap, her eyes fixed upon the floor. When at last she spoke, her voice had dropped almost to a whisper. "My name, Mr. Holmes, my true name, that is not entirely Faulkner. It is my mother's name, which I have used these many years since she and my father parted when I was but a child. My father's name was Carswell." Watson started visibly, and even Holmes, though he mastered his own reaction more swiftly, could not entirely conceal his surprise. "You are Edmund Carswell's daughter." "I am, Mr. Holmes, though I had not seen him nor spoken with him in 15 years, not since he left my mother and myself to face the consequences of a scandal I did not then understand, and have only lately begun to comprehend fully. I did not know when I boarded that train that the silent traveller 2 compartments away was my own father. I recognized him only by chance, some hours into the journey, through a trick of the light as he passed along the corridor to the lavatory, and I confess the shock of it kept me from my senses for some minutes. I went to the connecting door at Grantham, meaning to compose myself, and perhaps, though I had not fully decided, to go to him and speak, to ask him why, after all these years of silence far more complete than any mere affliction of the throat, he had never once written to me, never once sent word of his existence, though I knew him, from a chance encounter with an old family acquaintance 2 years past, to be very much alive and, I gathered, very much prosperous. "But you did not go to him," Holmes said gently. "I could not find the courage, Mr. Holmes. I stood at that door for some minutes, my hand upon the latch, and then I turned back to my own compartment, and I did not see him again, alive or otherwise, until his death was announced at King's Cross. I have said nothing of this to the police because I feared, foolishly perhaps, that the connection would cast suspicion upon me. A daughter abandoned, with cause enough for bitterness, found travelling by chance in the very carriage where her father met his death. Who would believe that such a coincidence was truly chance? "I believe it," Holmes said, "for the plain reason that a woman planning so calculated a murder would scarcely have permitted herself to be seen hovering at a connecting door by the very guard whose testimony might later condemn her. Nor would she have concealed her relationship to the victim only to reveal it, unprompted, the moment she was pressed with sympathy rather than accusation. No, Miss Faulkner, I do not suspect you of this crime, but I would ask whether your father, in the 2 years since you learned of his prosperity, ever attempted to communicate with you, or whether you learned anything further of the manner of life he had made for himself." "Only this, Mr. Holmes, that the same family acquaintance who told me he lived told me also, in a tone of some disapproval, that my father had grown rich through means she declined to specify, and that he numbered among his acquaintance certain gentlemen of rank and position who would, she implied, have been considerably discomfited to have that acquaintance generally known." Holmes's eyes had taken on their keenest light. "Did she name any of these gentlemen, Miss Faulkner?" "She did not, Mr. Holmes, or if she did, I confess I did not attend closely enough at the time to retain the name. I had no notion then that such information might ever prove of consequence." Chapter 13. Under Baker Street's Lamp. That night Holmes did not sleep, or if he did, Watson, who himself retired late and rose early, troubled by the accumulating strangeness of the case, saw no evidence of it. He found his friend, near 2 in the morning, exactly as he had left him some hours before, seated in his chair by the fire, a fresh pipe clenched between his teeth. The table before him now covered with a great disorder of papers, diagrams, and the small physical exhibits of the case arranged in a pattern whose logic was apparent, Watson suspected, to no mind but Holmes's own. "You have not slept, Holmes. Sleep is a luxury I cannot presently afford, Watson, with an innocent man in a cell at the yard and a guilty one walking free upon the strength of our continued ignorance. But I think, Watson, that I very nearly have the whole of it now." He rose and began to pace, a habit Watson had long since learned to interpret as the outward sign of thought approaching its resolution. "Consider what we know. A man skilled in the harvesting of secrets, travelling under a false name, murdered in a compartment locked from within by a mechanism I have now reconstructed to my own satisfaction, though I have not yet tested it in practice. A dagger of Eastern pattern, planted with clumsy haste in the desk of a man whose quarrel with the deceased was already known to the police. Too clumsy, Watson, for the same hand that contrived so elegant a solution to the problem of the locked door. A threatening note delivered to the one witness whose evidence, properly understood, points directly to the method of the murder, and a daughter who tells us, almost in passing, that her father's clientele included gentlemen of rank who would have been gravely discomfited by exposure. You are speaking of the Colonel. I am speaking of a pattern, Watson, which fits the Colonel very closely indeed, though I will not commit myself entirely until I have tested my reconstruction. Consider his manner when we called upon him. Too smooth, too eager to defend Ashworth, too practised in his account of an acquaintance with the dead man he claimed to be merely slight. Consider, too, that a colonel of the Indian Army, accustomed to campaign conditions, to fieldcraft, to the thousand small mechanical ingenuities a soldier learns in order to survive in hostile country, is precisely the kind of man who might contrive and execute with a steady hand the very trick I believe was used upon that compartment door. And consider, finally, that a man of Vane's rank and connections, 20 years in India, cannot have passed those years entirely without incidents he would prefer remained unknown. A court-martial averted, perhaps, or a scandal quietly suppressed through the intervention of superior officers grateful for his service. Such a man is exactly the sort of client Edmund Carswell's peculiar trade would have attracted, and exactly the sort of man who, discovering by dreadful chance that his blackmailer occupied the very next compartment on a night train to London, might calculate that Providence itself had handed him an opportunity too perfect to refuse. Then why not arrest him at once, Holmes, and be done with it? Because suspicion, however well-founded, is not proof, Watson, and a man of Vane's standing will not be convicted upon my reconstruction of a locked door, however elegant I believe that reconstruction to be. We must have the dispatch case, or its contents, or some other tangible link between Vane and the dead man that cannot be explained away by slight club acquaintance. And for that, I think, we must set a trap, for if my reading of this man's character is correct, he will not rest easy so long as he believes those letters remain undiscovered and capable of implicating him. He will come for them, Watson, if we can only persuade him they are within his reach. Chapter 14. The Bait. The plan Holmes laid before Lestrade the following morning was audacious enough to provoke considerable protest from the inspector, who did not relish the notion of releasing information to the press upon so delicate a matter without the fullest sanction of his superiors. "I am not asking you to release the truth, Lestrade," Holmes said patiently, "but a very carefully constructed falsehood, dressed convincingly enough to pass for truth to anyone reading it, in haste and with a guilty conscience. Let it be known, through the ordinary channels, a paragraph in the evening papers will suffice, that the dispatch case belonging to the murdered man, believed lost, has in fact been recovered, found by railway workmen beneath the carriage where it had evidently fallen or been thrown from the window during the crime, and that it is presently held at King's Cross Station, pending collection by Scotland Yard tomorrow morning, its contents as yet unexamined. And what do you expect this notice to accomplish, beyond alarming whoever possesses the real case, if such a person exists? Precisely that, Lestrade. Alarm. and more than alarm. If I am correct in my reasoning, the man who murdered Edmund Carswell did so principally to secure or destroy the contents of that case, believing them to constitute a mortal threat to his reputation, his career, perhaps his very liberty. He will have searched the case thoroughly since the murder. Indeed, I believe he has already done so, and either burned its contents or, more likely, retained whatever most directly concerns himself while disposing of the remainder, the case itself perhaps abandoned or destroyed. But a notice such as this, announcing that a case answering its description has been found and awaits examination by the police, will strike such a man with a very particular horror, for he cannot know, from a newspaper paragraph alone, whether this is in fact his own case, somehow recovered against all expectation, or some other article merely resembling it, and he dare not simply ignore the notice and hope for the best, not when his own safety hangs upon its contents remaining forever unknown. You believe he will attempt to steal it or destroy it before it can be examined. I believe he will come to King's Cross tonight, Lestrade, under cover of darkness, to satisfy himself of the truth of the matter, and if the case proves genuine, or convincingly so, to remove or destroy whatever remains within it before your officers can lay hands upon it in the morning. We have only to be waiting for him when he does. It required the better part of the afternoon, and no small application of Holmes's considerable ingenuity, to construct a dispatch case sufficiently convincing to serve as bait. An old case of similar pattern, procured from a dealer in the Tottenham Court Road, its brass corners artificially aged with acid to match Pike's description, and packed within with a quantity of blank paper bound to resemble, at a hasty glance in poor light, the private correspondence it was meant to represent. This was deposited, with elaborate and deliberately conspicuous secrecy, in the left luggage office at King's Cross that evening, under the eye of a clerk primed by Lestrade to appear entirely unaware of its significance, while the evening papers, true to Holmes's design, carried their carefully worded paragraph beneath a modest headline, "Railway Mystery, Missing Case Recovered." "There remains one difficulty, Holmes," Watson observed, as they watched the false case being carried into the office by a constable dressed for the occasion in a railway porter's coat. "If our man is indeed vain, he is no fool, and no coward either. He may come armed, and he may come prepared to fight rather than submit. I have considered as much, Watson, and I have asked Lestrade to post his men accordingly. 2 constables concealed within the goods shed opposite, a third stationed at the far end of the platform to cut off any retreat toward the street, and ourselves besides. I do not think Vane will attempt violence against a party of 5, even a soldier's courage having its practical limits. But I would not have you unprepared. Keep your revolver to hand, and do not hesitate to use it should the need arise, though I hope most sincerely that it will not. And if he does not come at all, if my reading of his character, or yours, has erred, and he simply lets the notice pass unremarked, then we shall have lost nothing but a night's sleep and the price of a second-hand dispatch case, Watson, and I shall be obliged to devise some fresh stratagem in the morning. But I do not believe that will be necessary. A man who has murdered once to preserve a secret does not sleep easily while so much as a rumour persists that the instrument of his exposure may yet fall into official hands. "Now, Watson," Holmes said, as they took up their position in the shadow of a goods shed some distance from the left luggage office, well after the station had fallen quiet for the night, "we have only to wait and to watch, and to hope that I have read our Colonel's character as accurately as I believe I have." Chapter 15. Fog over the sidings. The wait proved a long one, and a cold one, the November fog settling once more over the great dim spaces of the station, with a thickness that reduced the gas lamps along the platforms to mere smudges of yellow light, barely sufficient to illuminate the immediate ground beneath them. Lestrade and 2 constables had concealed themselves at vantage points of Holmes's own careful choosing, while Holmes and Watson kept their own watch from the shadow of the goods shed, close enough to observe the left luggage office without themselves being easily seen. It was past 1 in the morning by Watson's watch when a figure emerged from the fog, moving with the unhurried, purposeful gait of a man who wished to appear, to any casual observer, merely a late traveller about ordinary business, but whose eyes, Watson noted even at that distance, moved constantly and watchfully over the shadows to either side of his path. "There," Holmes breathed, scarcely above a whisper. "Steady, Watson. Let him commit himself fully before we move." The figure approached the left luggage office and paused before its shuttered window, and in the dim light, Watson felt his breath catch as the fog thinned, for a moment, sufficiently to reveal the unmistakable soldierly bearing, the weathered, handsome features of Colonel Reginald Vane. He worked for some moments at the lock of the shutter with an implement Watson could not clearly see, and then, with the swift efficiency of a man long practiced in tasks requiring both stealth and precision, drew it open and reached within. It was at this moment that Holmes gave the signal, a low, sharp whistle that brought Lestrade and his constables converging from 3 directions at once, their dark lanterns unshuttered in a sudden blaze of light that caught the colonel full in the face as he turned. The false dispatch case already half drawn from its hiding place, his expression transformed in an instant from cool purpose to something very near to panic. "Colonel Vane," Holmes said, stepping forward into the light, "I think you had better come quietly. The game, as I believe your countrymen in India were fond of remarking of the tiger who mistakes the tethered goat for easy prey, is very thoroughly up." For a moment it seemed the colonel might attempt flight, his body tensing with the coiled readiness of a man weighing his chances against 4 pursuers in unfamiliar darkness. But Watson, his hand already upon the revolver in his coat pocket, saw the calculation pass across Vane's features, and saw, too, the moment it resolved itself into a grim and bitter acceptance. "You have been remarkably thorough, Mr. Holmes," the colonel said at last, his earlier charm entirely stripped away to reveal something harder and colder beneath. "For a case I confess I believed unsolvable, I will say nothing further until I have consulted a solicitor, though I begin to suspect that even the most eloquent counsel in London will avail me little now." For a long moment no one spoke. The fog eddied about the little group in the lamplight, and somewhere far off across the shunting yards a locomotive released a long sigh of steam into the darkness, as though the great sleeping station itself had exhaled at the culmination of the drama played out upon its margins. Watson, his hand still resting upon the revolver he had not, in the end, needed to draw, found himself studying the colonel's face with something that was not quite pity and not quite satisfaction, but partook a little of each. The strange, complicated feeling that attends the unmasking of a man who has, for however wicked a purpose, borne himself throughout with a soldier's grim composure, even in defeat. Lestrade stepped forward at last to perform the formal office of arrest, his voice, for once, entirely without its habitual note of self-congratulation. "Colonel Reginald Vane, I am arresting you on suspicion of the wilful murder of the man known as Josiah Blackwood, otherwise Edmund Carswell, aboard the 10:45 night mail from Edinburgh on the night of the 14th instant. I must caution you that anything you say may be taken down and used in evidence against you." The colonel submitted to the handcuffs without further resistance, though Watson saw his eyes travel once, briefly, to the false dispatch case now lying open upon the cobbles where it had fallen from his grasp, its harmless cargo of blank paper spilling out into the damp, as though he could not quite yet credit that so elaborate a stratagem had been mounted, and mounted successfully, against a man who had evaded discovery for 15 years. "I would not depend upon silence to save you a second time, Colonel," Holmes said quietly, "for it did not save the man whose silence you mistook, quite wrongly, for weakness." Chapter 16. The Colonel Unmasked. At Scotland Yard, in the small hours of the morning, with Lestrade presiding and a police stenographer taking down every word, Colonel Vane's composure broke at last under the weight of Holmes's relentless and precisely aimed questioning, and the truth of the affair emerged in a confession as bitter as it was, in its way, pitiable. "You wish the whole of it, Mr. Holmes. Very well, you have earned it, if nothing else. 15 years ago, in India, I was responsible, directly responsible, though it was never proved against me, for the death of a young subaltern under my command, a death that occurred through my own negligence during a punitive expedition into hill country, and which I contrived, through certain falsifications of the official report, to attribute instead to enemy action. It was a shabby, cowardly thing to do, and I have lived with the knowledge of it for 15 years, buying my peace, as I believed, with the silence of the one other officer who knew the truth and who died himself, of fever, not 2 years later, taking my secret, as I thought, safely to his grave. But it did not die with him, Holmes said. No, some years ago, I do not know how, precisely, and I have never learnt the full extent of his sources, Carswell came into possession of a copy of the true report, the one I had suppressed, together with certain correspondence of my own that made my guilt in the matter unmistakable. He wrote to me, under an assumed name, proposing an arrangement he was pleased to call discreet, and I paid him, Mr. Holmes, for 3 years, sums that would astonish you, to preserve a silence I had thought already secured. When I boarded that train and discovered, to my absolute horror, that the silent, unremarkable fellow passenger 2 compartments from my own was Carswell himself, travelling, as I soon gathered from a note he passed me under cover of the guard's absence, with the full dossier of my ruin in the case beside him, I confess, Mr. Holmes, that something in me broke that had held firm for 15 years of careful, disciplined concealment. And so you killed him. I went to him, meaning only to plead, as I understand poor Ashworth also pleaded, though for a debt considerably graver than mere money. He was contemptuous, Mr. Holmes. He wrote me a note I will not soon forget, informing me that my usefulness to him, as he termed it, was very nearly exhausted, and that he intended, upon reaching London, to sell what he knew of me to a newspaper willing to pay handsomely for the ruin of a decorated officer. I do not offer this as excuse, only as explanation. I struck him with a blade I had carried since my India days, a habit of caution grown into instinct before I had fully understood what I intended to do, and it was done in an instant, Mr. Holmes, more swiftly and more silently than I could have believed possible. And the locked door. The Colonel's mouth twisted into something that was not quite a smile. A soldier's trick, Mr. Holmes, learned long ago and never forgotten. A length of stout cord, looped about the catch of the door before I left the compartment, its 2 ends drawn out beneath the door, and along the corridor floor to my own compartment 2 doors distant. I had only to draw upon both ends simultaneously, once the door was closed behind me, to turn the catch home from outside, and then to work one end free of the loop and draw the whole length through the narrow gap beneath the door. It required 2 attempts, Mr. Holmes, the cord catching upon the pile of the carpet within, which I understand now was overheard, to my very great misfortune, by the lady in the next compartment. But it was accomplished in the end, and the cord itself I destroyed within the hour, burned to ash in my own compartment's ashtray, and the ash scattered from the window at the first opportunity. Holmes nodded slowly, as a man confirming a calculation already privately completed. You took the dispatch case with you when you left. I did, and I regret to say I destroyed the greater part of its contents that same night, save for the papers concerning myself, which I have since burned entirely, and a quantity of blank paper with which I later replenished the case's weight and appearance, intending to plant it, at some safer opportunity, among Ashworth's effects to complete the impression of his guilt, a plan your own false notice in the evening papers rendered unnecessary before I could execute it, and which instead, I now see with some bitterness, drew me directly into your trap. The dagger in Ashworth's desk, Holmes said. That, I take it, was planted before our own investigation had properly begun. The morning after the murder, Mr. Holmes, while the man's dagger, a curio he had shown me once, in an idle conversation some months past, and mentioned kept always in that same drawer. Yes, that I obtained through a small deception upon his clerk, and returned, suitably marked, before suspicion could fall anywhere but upon the man whose quarrel with Carswell was already known to all the world. Lestrade, who had listened to this recitation with an expression of steadily deepening dismay, cleared his throat. Colonel Vane, I am obliged to inform you that you will be charged with the murder of Edmund Carswell, and with the attempted subornation of justice in the matter of Mr. Ashworth. Have you anything further to say? The colonel's shoulders sagged, the last of his soldierly bearing draining from him all at once, leaving only a tired and beaten man. Only this, Inspector, that I have spent 15 years believing myself the master of my own secret, and I find, in the end, that I was never anything but its prisoner. Perhaps that is justice enough, even without the gallows. Chapter 17. Holmes Explains. It was some days later, the immediate excitement of the arrest having subsided into the more measured business of preparing the case for trial, that Watson prevailed upon Holmes to lay out, in full and orderly fashion, the chain of reasoning by which he had arrived at the truth. For though Watson had followed the investigation at close quarters throughout, he confessed himself still uncertain of precisely how each thread had been drawn together into the whole. They sat that evening before the fire at Baker Street, Lestrade himself present at Holmes's invitation, a glass of the inspector's preferred whisky at his elbow in place of his usual notebook. The problem, Holmes began, presented itself from the first as a problem of method rather than of motive, for a locked compartment, however remote, is not truly locked to a mind willing to examine its mechanism with sufficient care. The catch itself, when I examined it in the siding, showed the faintest traces of wear upon its pivot, inconsistent with ordinary use, a slight roughening, as of a cord drawn repeatedly across metal under tension, combined with the scuff mark Watson himself observed in the carpet, running toward the door rather than away from it, and the fibre I recovered from the window seal, a strand of stout hempen cord, precisely the material a soldier would carry for a dozen practical purposes and think nothing of discarding. I had, within the first hour of examination, a very fair notion of the mechanism, if not yet of the hand that had employed it. But you did not share this with me at the time, Lestrade observed, not without a trace of remembered grievance. I did not, Lestrade, for the reasons I explained to Watson that same night. A partial truth, disclosed too soon, would have alerted our murderer to the precise extent of our knowledge, without yet furnishing us the means to act upon it. The wax I found beneath the door threshold confirmed the matter beyond reasonable doubt. A smear of ordinary candle wax, such as a man might use to grease a length of cord and ease its passage through a narrow gap, reducing both friction and the risk of a telltale sound. Mrs. Grant's account of a scraping, dragging sound, low down and repeated, drawn, released, and drawn again, was, once I had the mechanism clearly in mind, simply the final confirmation of what the physical evidence had already suggested, the sound of a cord being worked free of its loop about the catch, requiring 2 attempts before success. And how did you settle upon Vane rather than Ashworth, whose motive was, on the face of it, at least as strong? Motive alone, Lestrade, tells us only that a man might have wished the deed done. It tells us nothing of whether he possessed the particular skills required to do it in this particular fashion. Ashworth is a solicitor, a man of the desk and the law book, with no history that I could discover of fieldcraft, soldiering, or manual ingenuity of any kind. A man, moreover, whose own account of the crime, delivered with every appearance of shameful honesty, described a fit of temper and an abrupt departure, not the cold, patient labour of a cord worked twice through a narrow gap beneath a door. Vane, by contrast, was a soldier of 20 years Indian service, a man whose very profession demanded exactly the combination of nerve, patience and mechanical resourcefulness the crime required. When I added to this his curiously excessive eagerness to speak well of Ashworth, a generosity no innocent man in his position would have troubled himself to offer, unprompted, to a fellow suspect, and Miss Faulkner's chance remark regarding her father's clientele among gentlemen of rank uneasy at exposure, the pattern had become, to my mind, very difficult to read in any other way. "The dagger troubled you from the first," Watson said. The dagger was, in fact, the detail that most swiftly confirmed my suspicion of a frame, Watson, for it was too convenient by half, discovered, imperfectly cleaned, in the most obvious drawer of a desk, that any competent murderer, having successfully concealed his crime through so elaborate a mechanism as the corded catch, would never have been so careless as to leave lying about his own effects, however panicked. A man capable of the one could not plausibly be guilty of the other. The two pieces of evidence pointed, in effect, to two different characters entirely, and I had only to determine which character truly fit the crime, and which had been constructed after the fact to fit a convenient scapegoat. "And the trap at King's Cross?" Lestrade asked. "You were remarkably confident he would come." "I was confident, Lestrade, because I had, by that point, largely reconstructed Vane's character from the evidence of his own conduct. A proud man, accustomed to command, who had spent 15 years in careful, disciplined concealment of a single shameful secret, and who could not, I judged, endure the uncertainty of not knowing whether that secret had truly been recovered, and lay now within reach of official examination. Such a man does not wait passively for ruin to find him. He goes out to meet it, and to forestall it if he possibly can, even at very considerable risk to himself. It was, I confess, the single greatest wager of the entire investigation, but I had grown reasonably confident by then that I understood the man well enough to predict him. Chapter 18. Aftermath at Baker Street. Julius Ashworth was released from custody within the day. His gratitude toward Holmes so profuse and so evidently sincere that Watson found himself genuinely moved by the spectacle of a man restored, quite suddenly, from the shadow of the gallows to the ordinary business of life. He called at Baker Street himself, some days later, to offer his thanks in person, and to confess, with a candour Watson thought did him considerable credit, that he intended to make full restitution of his debts, however long it might take, and to trouble the gaming tables of Leicester Square no further. "I do not know how to thank you, Mr. Holmes," he said, wringing Holmes's hand with rather more force than that reserved gentleman generally welcomed. "You have given me back my life, quite literally, and I shall not waste the gift. You have only to make good your own resolution, Mr. Ashworth, and the debt, such as it is, will be fully discharged," Holmes said, extracting his hand with characteristic economy of sentiment. "I would only observe that a man who has stood so near the edge of ruin, through folly rather than malice, generally makes the wiser reformed character for the experience." Mrs. Grant, too, called to express her relief that the threat against her had been so swiftly and thoroughly removed, and Watson could not help but notice, in the warmth of Holmes's reception of her, a courtesy rather more marked than his usual professional civility, though whether this signified anything beyond simple regard for a witness whose careful honesty had contributed so materially to the solution of the case, Watson did not presume to inquire. It was Eleanor Faulkner's visit, however, that lingered longest in Watson's memory, for she came not to offer thanks but to ask a single question, delivered with the quiet directness of a woman who had spent the intervening days in hard and honest reflection upon her own feelings. "Was my father truly so wicked a man as it now appears, Mr. Holmes? I find I cannot entirely reconcile the figure described in the newspapers with whatever fragments of memory I retain from childhood. A man who was not unkind to me, in his way, whatever else he became afterward." Holmes considered the question with evident care before answering, and when he spoke, it was with a gentleness Watson had rarely heard him extend to matters of moral judgment. "I did not know your father in life, Miss Faulkner, and I am reluctant to pronounce final verdict upon a character I encountered only through the evidence of his death and the testimony of those he had wronged. I will say only this, that a man may follow a shameful trade for many years without every part of his nature being consumed by it, and that the capacity for tenderness you recall from childhood need not have been false merely because it did not, in the end, prevail against whatever led him to the path he later chose. He was, I think, a man who mistook the gathering of power over others for a kind of safety, and who paid, at the last, the fullest possible price for that mistake. Whether that makes him wicked or merely weak and unwise, I leave to gentler judges than myself." Miss Faulkner left Baker Street that afternoon with something in her bearing that had not been present at their first interview. Not quite peace, Watson thought, but perhaps the beginning of it, the first loosening of a burden she had carried, unacknowledged, for far longer than the few days since her father's death. Chapter 19. A Quiet Word. That evening, the fire burning low and the fog, for once, thinning sufficiently to admit a pale gleam of moonlight through the sitting-room window, Watson found himself moved to remark upon the peculiar melancholy that seemed to have settled over his friend in the case's aftermath, a mood not uncommon in Holmes once the intellectual excitement of pursuit had given way to the quieter, sadder business of consequence. "You seem thoughtful tonight, Holmes, for a man who has just secured a conviction that will surely follow, and freed an innocent man besides." "I am thinking, Watson, of silence," Holmes said, "and of the very great many purposes to which it may be put." Carswell wielded his silence as a weapon, extracting from it a power over other men's secrets that honest speech could never have afforded him. Vane maintained his silence for 15 years as a shield, believing that what was never spoken could never be proven, until the weight of that unspoken thing grew heavier than the crime required to preserve it. Ashworth's silence, by contrast, very nearly cost him his life, for he could not bring himself to speak the truth of his own shame until directly confronted with it. And in withholding that truth, he permitted suspicion to fasten upon him with a fatal completeness. And Miss Faulkner's silence, gentlest of them all, was born of nothing more sinister than grief and fear, and cost her only the added burden of secrets she need never have carried alone. "I draw an observation, Watson, which is a humbler thing than a moral, and considerably more useful. It is this, that silence is never truly empty. Men imagine, when they say nothing, that they have thereby said nothing at all, committed themselves to nothing, revealed nothing. But silence, examined closely enough, speaks as plainly as any confession, if only one has learned to read it. The silence of a man too proud to admit his fear, the silence of a man too ashamed to admit his need, the silence of a man who has convinced himself that what is never named cannot be real." Our friend Carswell built an entire fortune upon that fallacy, extracting his living from precisely the secrets men believed their silence had rendered safe. It is a fitting irony, I think, that in the end his own silence, the false, cultivated muteness he wore as a kind of armour, proved no protection whatever against a blade wielded by a man who had likewise mistaken silence for safety. He rose, knocking the ash from his pipe into the grate, and crossed to the window, looking out over the lamplit street below with an expression Watson could not entirely read. "There will be another case tomorrow, Watson, or the day after. There generally is, in this city of 8 million souls and their 8 million secrets. But I confess I shall not soon forget the man who never spoke, nor the silence that, in the end, betrayed him quite as thoroughly as any careless word ever could have done." He turned back into the room, and something of his usual brisk energy returned to his bearing, as though he had, with characteristic discipline, set the melancholy of the case firmly behind him. "Now, Watson, I believe there is a very tolerable supper waiting downstairs. and I find that even the contemplation of human folly does not, in my experience, improve upon an empty stomach. Shall we? And so, as on so many evenings before and since, Sherlock Holmes turned from the solved mystery to the ordinary business of life, leaving to Watson, as always, the task of setting down upon paper what memory and admiration together could preserve of the singular workings of that extraordinary mind. The end.